In the silence of the kitchen, among the brooms leaning against the wall and the dishes drying in the morning sun, she felt for the first time the touch of a man she never imagined reaching. The millionaire who had been passing through the hallways as if she were invisible that morning stopped, looked into her eyes and, without words, kissed her as if the whole world were suspended. But the enchantment lasted less than the aroma of the coffee he was preparing. At the end of that same day, she was called to the office, dismissed without explanation, with a cold envelope in her hands and the kiss still burning on her lips. He did not have the courage to look her in the eyes, and she, who had nothing but dignity, left through the back door while the bells of the mansion rang for a gala dinner. What he never imagined was that this cowardly gesture would set in motion the kind of justice that money cannot buy. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just walked with dry eyes and a broken soul. No one in the mansion understood why the most dedicated employee had left so suddenly. Only he knew. And he tried to erase her memory like someone closing a window, but the wind kept coming in. Her name kept coming back in absurd situations, like a delicate and constant shadow. And the more he avoided her, the more life seemed to play with his arrogance. Little by little, he lost his taste for the perfection of his routine. The parties became empty. The models' smiles seemed plastic. And somewhere in the city, that woman with serene eyes and calloused hands began to walk a path that, without him knowing, would lead him to his own mirror, and to his greatest regret. If you feel that this story has something to say to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and come with us, because what is to come may speak directly to your heart. She arrived early, as she always did. Her uniform was starched, her hair tied up neatly, her badge crooked in her left pocket, and she had that expression that mixed dignity with weariness. The Harrison mansion was silent in the morning, as if she were afraid of waking her own ghosts. While the residents were still asleep, she was already cleaning the marble porch with almost ritualistic precision. Her name was Elisa, and to everyone there she was just the cleaning lady. But to herself it was all that was left, the last step before disappearing. At 32, she carried on her shoulders the memory of a youth she never had, of a freedom that always seemed like a distant luxury. Her father disappeared when she still wore braids. Her mother, who fought to the end against a cruel cancer, left her only a sewing box and a phrase: "Don't bow down to anyone, my daughter, not even to those who have more money." Elisa did not bow down, in fact. She did her work with an upright posture, with discreet pride. She never allowed herself to dream of anything other than a clean room and paid bills, until he came along. Caleb Harrison was the kind of man who didn't need to speak to command a room. He had the eyes of someone who had always gotten everything he wanted, effortlessly, without guilt. The third-generation heir to a real estate empire, he lived in that mansion as if he were on a throne. Always serious, always clean, always distant. But on a grey Tuesday, everything went off script. She was cleaning the window of the reading room when he came in barefoot, holding a cup and looking smaller than usual. He looked at her for a few seconds too long, and he didn't say anything. He just left the cup on the table and kept looking. Time seemed to double, as if the air between them was different. Elisa didn't know what to do with her hands. She squeezed the wet cloth tightly. And then, as if he had been pushed by something invisible, Caleb approached, lightly ran his hand over her face and kissed her. It was a restrained kiss, but real, without words, without justifications. She felt the world disappear beneath her feet. For an instant, there were no bosses or employees, castes or classes. There were two human beings wounded by time, trapped in places they did not choose, connected by something neither of them knew how to name. And yet, he pulled back, too quickly. The eyes that had once seemed so certain now fled like those of a frightened child. And before she could even ask why, he had already left the room without looking back. Elisa went back to work in silence, but she felt something pulsing. Inside her chest, like a warning, something was about to change, and it would change irreversibly. She didn't tell anyone, not even the neighbor who shared the laundry room with her in the basement of the building, nor the woman at the grocery store who always asked about the bosses. She kept that kiss as if she kept a relic inside her chest, between fear and hope. But she also couldn't forget the way he left, as if it were an unforgivable mistake. Elisa had already learned from life that when the rich make mistakes, the poor are the ones who pay. That's why she kept quiet, smiling with her eyes, avoiding passing him in the hallways, acting as if nothing had happened. But inside, everything was already different. And this different hurt. At night, in her cramped little room with its musty, longing smell, she remembered his touch, his warm hand, his lost gaze. And she asked herself, why would he kiss her, if it wasn't for real? Days passed, and Caleb didn't mention the subject. Again. In fact, he didn't even look at her again. He walked straight past, avoided eye contact, and turned away like a cowardly teenager. And that was worse than any rejection. Elisa had little in life, but her pride was intact. Still, she wondered if she had imagined it all. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe it was just an impulse. Maybe it was just a joke. But then, why was his hand shaking? Why was he breathing heavily? Why was he silent? Elisa knew the signs of a lie. That wasn't a lie. It was fear. Caleb, on the other hand, was conflicted. He grew up hearing that servants are not friends, much less lovers. In his family, the divisions were always clear. Those who serve, serve. Those who give orders, give orders. And he, who had inherited more rules than affection, didn't know what to do with what he felt. The kiss haunted him. He couldn't forget her. The lightness in her eyes, the dignity with which she held the bucket of water, the way she never tried to draw attention to herself, and yet it was impossible not to notice her presence. Caleb tried to convince him that it was just desire. But deep down, he knew it was something more dangerous. It was humanity. And that, in his world, cost a lot. Caleb's mother, upon realizing that her son was absent, attributed his behavior to business pressure. She suggested that he travel, that he rest, that he find a new female companion among the partner's daughters. But he refused all invitations. He spent more time at home than usual, and yet he avoided the only person who made him feel alive. The internal conflict grew, and the more he avoided her, the more she took shape inside him. The fear of falling in love with someone outside the norm was greater than the courage to admit that his world was false. And then, on a morning that seemed like any other, Elisa was called into the main office. One of the house managers handed her an envelope with her month's salary and said coldly, "The family has decided to reduce the staff." There was no warning, no thanks, no justification, just a dry, functional goodbye. Caleb didn't show up. He didn't say goodbye. Elisa swallowed her disappointment, picked up her few belongings, and left through the back, as if she were to blame for something she had never understood. The sound of the gate closing behind her was more painful than the kiss. She didn't know it, but what had begun there was not the end. It was the beginning of a silent revenge that life itself would organize. The first night outside the mansion was colder than usual. Elisa slept on a thin mattress lent to her by a cleaning lady who shared a small apartment with 2 children. The window didn't close properly, and the noise of the city seemed to mock her silence. But she didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she had cried too much in her life, and she had learned that certain pains can only be healed with movement. The next day, before sunrise, she was already in line at a city employment center. She was afraid of meeting the scornful gaze again, but she wore the same uniform as if it were armor. When asked why she had been fired, she simply said, "Staff cuts." No one suspected a kiss. No one imagined that behind that firm gaze was a woman carrying the bitter taste of cowardice. Meanwhile, Caleb lived a rehearsed routine, surrounded by important decisions, meetings and parties, but nothing seemed to have any value anymore. He began to sleep little. He had nightmares in which Elisa stared at him in silence, as if demanding answers. He tried to fill the void with distractions. He bought a new car, traveled to the Caribbean, was seen at events with actresses and influencers, but nothing filled it. On the contrary, everything became emptier afterwards. It was like eating too much while hungry for something else. In the mansion, he avoided going through the reading room. That place smelled like her. Once, he found a cleaning cloth forgotten in a corner. He picked it up. Without thinking, sniffed it discreetly, and then threw it away in anger. Anger at himself, at his own weakness. And at the truth he didn't want to face. He had fallen in love. Elisa, in turn, was called for an interview at a small community center in the Bronx. The place was simple but full of life. They needed someone to help with the cleaning and, if possible, provide support with sewing workshops for vulnerable women. She accepted immediately. It was like breathing again. In that place, no. One cared about last names, luxury cars, or inheritances. The stories were raw, human, real, and there in the midst of other people's pain, she began to heal her own. Each woman she helped was like a wound of hers being treated too. She didn't need great miracles, just a space where the truth could fit. Meanwhile, Caleb became a ghost of his former self. His partners began to notice his emotional absence. Projects were delayed. His confidence was diminishing, and yet he insisted on pretending that everything was fine. Until, during a corporate dinner, he saw a waitress with the same walk as Elisa. His heart raced. It was another woman, of course, but for a few seconds he wished it were her. And there, amidst forced laughter and glasses of wine, he understood that what he had lost was not just an employee. She was the only person who had truly seen him. Elisa no longer had time for memories. Her mornings were rushed, her afternoons were spent in workshops, and at night she took literacy courses and later advanced sewing. She discovered that her greatest joy was not in forgetting the past, but in reinventing herself. And little by little, she began to design clothes, create patterns, and help other women sew their own dreams. The community center became a fertile field for her soul. And even though there was still pain, it no longer bled. She had learned to transform it into purpose. A few months had passed since the day she left through the back door of the mansion. With each dawn, the distance between that kiss and the new Elisa seemed to grow. But there were days when the body forgot that the soul had already moved on. All it took was a song on the radio, a scent in the hallway, a similar whisper, and everything would come back. Still, she wouldn't let herself stop. The work at the center grew. The women trusted her, and she discovered that she was strong, admired, and needed. They began to invite her to small events as a guest, then as a speaker. She spoke little, but when she did, she touched people deeply. Life had started to make sense again, and then, when she no longer expected it, he crossed her path again. It was a warm fall afternoon. The center was organizing a fundraising event and needed financial support. A generous sponsorship was offered by one of the largest companies in the city. The name on the document, Harrison Group. Elisa froze. Her heart raced as if recognizing an old smell. The event manager thought she was surprised by the amount donated. Elisa just nodded but didn't say that she knew the name better than she would have liked. For emotional safety, he declined the sponsorship. He said he preferred to keep the support of small local businesses. The coordinator didn't understand, but she respected it. The event took place and it was a success. Across town, Caleb read the rejection email like it was a punch. He hadn't known that the center where Elisa worked was the same one his company had directed donations to. A coincidence or a silent reckoning of fate. When he saw her name on the organizing team, he stood still for long minutes. He knew he had no right to show up, but he also knew he couldn't stay away. For the first time in years, he acted without consulting his advisors. He got in his car and drove to the center. He stopped on the other side of the street. He looked around. He saw children running, women smiling, a life he had never known. And among them, Elisa, stronger, more beautiful, more in control of herself. She saw him, but she pretended not to. A quick glance was enough to recognize that man standing there, hidden behind a lamp post like a guilty man. And inside, something in her trembled. But it wasn't love. It was a mixture of indignation and strange compassion. He seemed smaller. And in that moment she understood. She had gotten over it. Still, the past is not a door that closes forever. He came back once more, days later, pretending to be just a volunteer curious to get to know the center. She welcomed him politely. She showed him the rooms, the projects, the pamphlets. He asked her trivial questions. She answered with cold words and a firm smile. But his eyes said it all. He wanted to apologize, but he didn't have the courage, and she no longer needed to hear it. That night, Caleb wrote a letter. He wanted to leave it in her hands, but he couldn't. He folded the paper and left it at the reception desk with a false name. The next day, Elisa saw the envelope. She recognized the handwriting. She opened it. She read it. She took a deep breath, and she burned the paper in the backyard. Some words are no longer useful when they arrive too late. The following week, the community center received an unexpected invitation. One of its representatives had been nominated for a local award for social impact. Elisa thought it was a mistake. She had never done anything expecting recognition. But it was real. Her name was there, plastered on. Posters around the city, along with other women who had transformed entire communities. The ceremony would be low-key but elegant. A glass-enclosed ballroom, white flowers and press. When she took the stage, wearing a simple dress and with tears in her eyes, she heard her own name being pronounced by someone she never expected to see again. Caleb Harrison. He was the guest of honor at the event, and ironically, the one in charge of presenting the award. On the outside, he looked like the same impeccable man he had been years ago. On the inside, he carried the weight of all the silences. When he reached out to hand her the trophy, she looked at him for the first time since that kiss. And in that silent exchange, everything was said. The audience applauded, but they were both in another time, another place. He tried to whisper something, an apology, a rescue of dignity, but she had already taken 2 steps away. He smiled for the cameras. He thanked them in a firm voice. He said he dedicated the award to all the women who learned to get up even after being put down. And he stepped off the stage to applause, not for her, but for all the versions of himself that were once silenced. Caleb, sitting back at the head table, was sinking into a pain he couldn't name. She didn't hate him. It was worse, she no longer recognized him, and this indifference was the harshest sentence he could receive, because deep down he still loved her. But it was too late to fix what he had. Destroyed with a cold signature on a resignation envelope. He tried to approach her on the way out, but she waved goodbye with a brief, polite wave. A gesture that closed a cycle with more force than any shout. And he returned home on the subway, with the trophy in his lap and his eyes closed, not in pain but in peace. That night, alone in her small apartment, she placed the trophy on the dresser. Beside it, a picture of her mother, smiling. "You were right, Mum," she whispered. "I never stooped." Across town, Caleb opened a bottle of wine and sank into a quiet room, surrounded by luxury but devoid of anything that truly belonged to him. He watched the scene of her receiving the award again. He wanted to erase it all, start over. But there was no more over. The story that began with a kiss ended with a silent and final goodbye. In the days that followed, Caleb tried to ignore the hole that was opening up beneath his feet. The sight of her smiling on stage haunted him with painful clarity. He, who had always known how to control situations, was now hostage to a regret that made him feel small. He spent hours in his car, parked in front of the community center, just watching people come and go. Once, he saw Elisa helping an elderly woman out of a taxi, holding her bags with the same kindness with which she had once taken care of his house. Instead of getting out and talking to her, he simply lowered the car seat, as if shame paralyzed him. He was no longer the same man who had fired her, but he also didn't know who he was becoming. Meanwhile, Elisa didn't realize how much her presence still affected the person who tried to erase her. She was too busy growing up. The sewing workshops became famous. Her firm speech and her example of overcoming obstacles caught the attention of universities, NGOs, and even sustainable fashion companies. Little by little, she went from coordinator to symbol of transformation. She accepted interviews, but always with the same simplicity. When asked about her past, she would answer sweetly, "I used to be invisible. Today I just want to help other women see themselves." She never mentioned names. She never talked about the mansion. It was as if that story had been swallowed by a fire that no longer burned. But fate, always aware of what remains in doubt, found a way to bring the two together again. One of the young women who had been helped by the project had won a scholarship to study fashion in another city, and a farewell ceremony was organized. The venue chosen was an old theater, renovated with the support of sponsors. One of them? The Harrison Foundation. Caleb wasn't sure if she knew, but he showed up anyway. He sat discreetly in the back rows. During the event, Elisa was called to the stage to give a speech of thanks. And as always, she spoke from the heart. He said that true wealth lies in lifting up those who have fallen, and that no one should be ashamed of coming from below, because that is where the strongest roots grow. When he finished, the audience stood up. Caleb did too, but he didn't applaud. He just looked at her. She saw him. For a second, time stopped again. There was pain in that look. But there was also something else, liberation. And as she stepped off the stage, she turned away from her path, not out of anger, but because the love that had once existed had transformed into something else, into healing. And healing is not shared with those who have wounded your soul and then run away. That night, as she walked through the neighborhood streets, Elisa remembered the kiss. Not with longing, but with the serenity of someone who knows that certain stories only serve to push us toward ourselves. She was no longer the same woman who cleaned the reading room window. Now she cleaned invisible wounds, on others and on herself, and each stitch sewn in her workshops was also a stitch in the scar that had stopped bleeding. In the weeks that followed, Elisa immersed herself even more intensely in the work of the center. Workshops began to multiply. In addition to sewing, they opened classes in cooking, urban gardening, and basic accounting for women who dreamed of opening small businesses. Her eyes shone not with fame, but with purpose. The pain that had once been her companion was now the raw material for generating healing in others, and this was greater than any memory. Still, every now and then, life gave signs that it had not finished its dance with the past. Caleb, even without knowing why, insisted on keeping her name close. His foundation discreetly sponsored the projects in which she worked, never with demands, never with appearances, only with the weight of guilt, trying to find some form of redemption. But time, that silent sculptor, had already transformed Elisa into another woman, sure of who she was, full of herself in her journey, and for that very reason, vulnerable to the most human feelings. One afternoon, while looking through old photos of graduating students, she came across an image that made her stop. It was from her first class. At the back of the room, in the corner of the whiteboard, a note was stuck. "You are greater than any place you came from." The handwriting was her own, scribbled on a day of pain that now seemed so distant. She smiled, and in that smile, a tear fell. Not from missing him, but from the woman she had been when she was still waiting for something that would never come. Caleb, on the other hand, was starting to lose his protective layers. The corporate life that had once defined him now felt like a mask that was too heavy to wear. He avoided social events, he ignored arranged dating invitations, he began visiting group homes, nursing homes, daycare centers, perhaps trying to understand what it meant to be of service without receiving anything in return. And on one of these visits, he was recognized by a volunteer at Elisa's center. She looked at him warily and asked, "Aren't you the man who hurt our founder?" He didn't answer. He just lowered his head. The silence was his confession. That night he wrote another letter, this time addressed directly to Elisa. He said he did not expect forgiveness, nor an answer. But he needed to thank her for making him see how small he was, and therefore how much he needed to grow. He ended by saying that if she ever saw him cleaning a room or carrying boxes in silence, it was not humiliation. It was transformation. Elisa received the letter. She read it. She folded it carefully. She put it between the pages of the diary where she wrote down her dreams, and she sighed deeply. The next day, when she walked into the center, something had changed in her. It wasn't love reborn. It was a lightness that only comes when the soul finally stops fighting what can no longer be. She smiled at the women around her, put on her lab coat, and went back to class. But now, her every word was a reminder. Pain doesn't define us. It's what we do with it that makes us rare. Over time, Elisa's name spread beyond the walls of the community center. Universities invited her to tell her story in seminars on women's empowerment. Social enterprises sought partnerships with their projects. And even though the world wanted to put her in the spotlight, she remained true to the land she came from. She refused awards that would turn her into an empty symbol. She preferred to stay there, weaving dreams and listening to stories of women who, like her, had been discarded by a system blind to dignity. However, a new invitation arrived, different from all the previous ones. It was a National Congress on Public Policies for Social Inclusion. And she wouldn't just be a speaker. They wanted her to open the event. At first, she hesitated. She felt that the stage was too big for her simple words. But she was convinced by a young woman from the center who saw her as a spiritual mother. You don't talk nicely, Elisa. You speak the truth. And that's what the world needs. On the night of the presentation, the auditorium was packed. Leaders, business people, journalists, students. When she went on stage, her breathing seemed heavy. But as soon as she started to tell about the window she cleaned every morning, about the unexpected kiss and about her silent dismissal, the room was filled with a profound silence. Each word came like a needle stitching together other people's wounds. From the back of the audience, Caleb listened to her. Not as the arrogant man who once hid behind a surname, but as someone who finally accepted being just a man. There was no resentment in her words. There was compassion. When she finished, she didn't ask for applause. She thanked them. She simply said, "It's not about me, it's about all of us who were once forgotten but never forgot who we are." And she stepped off the stage with the lightness of someone who no longer carries ghosts on her shoulders. As she left the event, some people tried to approach her. They offered contracts, they offered paid lectures. She thanked them but turned most of them down. She returned home by train, sitting next to a woman who was dozing with her head resting against the window. On Elisa's lap was an envelope with photos of the women from the center. She looked at each face as if revisiting chapters of a book that was still being written. When she arrived, she stopped at the corner grocery store, bought bread and milk, and walked back. That was what kept her feet on the ground, the normality she had achieved without needing anyone to support her. The next morning, while she was organizing registration forms for new students, she saw a familiar name. It wasn't Caleb. It was the housekeeper at the Harrison mansion. Now retired, she wanted to learn how to sew. Elisa smiled. It would be impossible to deny her request. When the woman arrived at the first class, she ran to hug her. "You've always been great, my daughter. It just took them a while." "To see it." Elisa held the hug for longer than necessary, because there in that gesture there was something of forgiveness that not even words could explain. The reunion with the old housekeeper awakened memories in Elisa that she had believed were dormant. For the first time in years she heard stories of the mansion she had left behind, and even among memories of dinners, parties, and protocols, Caleb's name appeared with less imposingness. "He has changed," the woman said, as she sewed a piece of fabric onto the pattern. "He stays silent for days. Every now and then he shows up at shelters, at reception centers. I don't know what he's looking for. Maybe to forgive himself." Elisa didn't answer, but that sentence kept echoing inside her. She didn't want any more punishment. She wanted him to understand the gravity of having torn out a feeling by the roots, and even so, left the soil open. In the following weeks, discreet news began to circulate. Caleb had stepped down as president of the Harrison Empire. He gave up his position as director, sold part of his shares, and began volunteering for social foundations. He made no public announcement. He simply disappeared from the spotlight. No one understood. Some thought it was an emotional crisis. Others thought it was a hushed-up scandal. But Elisa knew. Life, in its silent justice, had placed mirrors where he had only seen thrones. Now, with his hands free of contracts and his pockets full of time, Caleb sought to find meaning in his own existence. Meanwhile, the community center was receiving more women than it could accommodate. Workshops were multiplying in other neighborhoods, led by Elisa's former students. A silent network of transformation was beginning to spread. And although her name was behind it all, she refused to be called a leader. "I'm just one more. Each one here carries a hidden miracle. I just help unwrap it." And that was it. Her strength lay in the invisible, in the way she taught a woman to look at herself in the mirror with tenderness, in the silence with which she listened without judging, in the way she remained whole, even after being broken. One of those days, when she entered the center, she found a simple bouquet on her desk, white lilies and an unsigned letter. The note simply said, "I'm not seeking forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that there's not a day that goes by that I don't wish I had done everything differently." Elisa recognized the handwriting. She didn't tear it up or burn it. She put it in the same box where she kept the drawings of the first pieces she helped sew, not as a souvenir, but as a testimony. Sometimes, even the deepest scars become part of the map that guides us. That night, when she closed the gate to the center, she saw a man sitting on a bench in the square in front. She didn't need to get closer to know who it was. He didn't look at her. He just watched the lights on in the windows of the building as, if he were seeing for the first time what really mattered. Elisa didn't go to him, nor he to her, and perhaps this was the most profound form of reunion. Two lives that recognize each other even in silence, accepting that certain paths, even if crossed, were not meant to walk side by side. Winter arrived early that year. The wind cut through the streets like a razor, and the sidewalks became a refuge for bodies forgotten by the rush of the world. Elisa began organizing emergency campaigns to collect clothes and food. The classes at the community center were temporarily transformed into shelters. Each classroom became a shelter, each outstretched hand a gesture of resistance. It was in this scenario that a journalist appeared, interested in writing a report on the impact of the project. But upon hearing the stories, she realized there was something bigger. A woman who had lifted hundreds of people up without ever asking for anything in return. And, for the first time, Elisa agreed to tell her story to the media. The story aired on a Sunday night on national television. Millions of people watched the woman with the calm voice, direct gaze, and hands marked by sewing say that self-love is the key to freedom. She said she didn't hate anyone, but that she had to break away from everything that made her small. She didn't name names. She didn't accuse anyone. She just told about a kiss, a dismissal, and a choice, not to be defined by abandonment, but by the courage to move on. The next day, the center received donations from all over the country, and a handwritten letter arrived in the mail, with an illegible sender. Inside, a clipping of the story and a handwritten sentence. "Today, finally, I understood what I lost." She didn't cry. She smiled, a tired smile, but at peace. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. That same week, a major sustainable clothing brand approached the center to propose a collection designed by the students of the project. They wanted Elisa to coordinate the creation. The proposal included training, royalties for the seamstresses, and national exposure. Elisa hesitated. She didn't like the spotlight. But as she looked at each face inside, she understood that it wasn't about her. It was about opening doors that others never imagined walking through. And so she said yes. As the patterns were drawn, the first pieces sewn, and the students' names embroidered on the linings of the garments, a new energy took over the center. It was as if the past was finally serving as a foundation and no longer a chain. One day, while checking the finishing touches on a blouse, a young woman asked Elisa if she had ever been in love. She stopped for a second, arranged the piece on the table, and calmly replied, "Yes, and that's what taught me to love myself first." The young woman smiled, not fully understanding, but one day she would understand. Across town, Caleb watched from afar. He knew this was a fate he could have shared, but he didn't have the courage to earn it. He kept working quietly, now in soup kitchens, sweeping sidewalks at rehab centers, helping ex-offenders find jobs. He found that doing good without being seen was more transformative than any title. One day, in a donation sorting shed, he found a bag of clothes labeled with names embroidered on them. One of them read, "Hope." I knew without a shadow of a doubt where it had come from. On the eve of the launch of the collection created by the seamstresses from the center, the neighborhood looked different. The improvised shop windows displayed simple pieces, but full of meaning. Each seam told a story. Each embroidery had a name, pain, and overcoming. The show would be outdoors, under the lights strung between the lampposts, with live music played by volunteers. There was no luxurious catwalk, just a sidewalk hand-painted by the students themselves. And in the center of it all was Elisa, coordinating the details with the same attention with which she swept the mansion years ago. Nothing about her had been corrupted. On the contrary, each step made her more whole, more complete, more rare. Early in the evening, the crowd began to arrive. Residents of the community, supporters, journalists, curious onlookers, but also discreetly him, Caleb. He wore ordinary clothes, had longer hair, and was unshaven. He mingled with the anonymous people as if he wanted to blend in. He didn't bring cameras or promises. He just had the sincere desire to see with his own eyes what she had built after the silence he had planted. When the music started, and the first young woman appeared wearing a jacket embroidered with the word "Start Over," a shiver ran down his spine. In each model, there was more truth than in the advertising campaigns he had financed for years. Elisa appeared at the end, pushed by the insistence of the students who wanted her to receive the applause. She walked down the sidewalk with humility, without makeup, without forced shine. When she stopped in the center and looked at the audience, her eyes met his, and it was an eternal second. There was no resentment, no expectation, only a silent acknowledgement. There was the man who had been the trigger for her pain, and, paradoxically, the spark for a new beginning. She lowered her head slightly in recognition and returned to her seat. He did not come closer. She knew he did not need it. What she needed from him, he did not give her when it still made sense. At the end of the event, as the lights went out, Elisa remained seated on the last bench in the square. She watched the children dismantling the stage with laughter, the mothers collecting the colorful cloths, the men carrying speakers. The young seamstress who had asked her about love a few days earlier approached her. She sat next to her in silence for a few minutes. Then she said, "Today I understood what you meant. Sometimes we only learn to love ourselves after someone denies us." Elisa smiled. There was truth in that sentence, and it was no longer a wound, it was a lesson. That same night, Caleb returned to his small rented apartment, a single room, no servants, no luxuries. On the table was a pile of unsent letters to Elisa, all sincere, all belated. He picked up the one he had written most recently. He burned it. Then he lit a candle, as if he were keeping a silent vigil for his own redemption. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him, but now he understood. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about becoming worthy of looking back and knowing that for once in his life, he had loved someone who taught him to be better. The following months passed like a gentle breeze through the branches of a new life. Elisa now ran 3 community centers spread across different neighborhoods, all with the same principle: to restore dignity through silence, respect, and hands that unite. She never accepted being called director or founder. She preferred to be seen as just another one among many. She wore the same clothes as always, took the subway and greeted street vendors by name. Her greatness lay precisely in the fact that she never had to prove anything to anyone, and that, more than any trophy, was what inspired her. One Tuesday afternoon, a team from the city government showed up unannounced. They were carrying an unprecedented tribute. A new women's empowerment building built with public funds would be named after Elisa. She refused twice, but finally gave in. "As long as you don't take away the names of any of the women who helped me become who I am." The request was accepted, and the plaque that would be placed at the entrance read, Elisa Martins Hope Center, because when one woman stands up, others stop crawling. She cried when she saw it, not out of vanity, but because there, on that wall, was the validation of everything that had once tried to take from her. On the other side of town, Caleb lived a modest life. He worked quietly in a charity kitchen. He mopped floors. He washed dishes. He avoided questions. But every now and then, someone would recognize him. "Are you that millionaire?" He would simply respond with a shy smile and go back to work. He no longer felt ashamed. It was his way of paying off the invisible debt he carried. Some mornings he would pass by one of the centers named after Elisa. He would stop on the other side of the street, watch for a few minutes, and then move on. He never went inside. He knew that space was too sacred for his presence. On a special occasion, a group of girls from the project were invited to perform at a youth entrepreneurship fair. One of them, when telling her story on stage, cited Elisa as her greatest inspiration. She said that before learning to sew, she had learned to breathe again, that before learning to walk in heels, she had learned to stand on her own, and that one day she wanted to be for others what Elisa had been for her. Many in the audience cried. Caleb did too. Sitting at the back of the auditorium, hidden under a cap, he saw clearly what he had lost, not a woman, but the chance to be better alongside someone who was already a light when he was still a shadow. That night, as the center closed, Elisa sat down with an old notebook in her hands. She leafed through pages written in simple handwriting, with dates, dreams, and random phrases. In one of them, she had written years ago, "If I disappear tomorrow, may at least someone remember that I loved truly." She smiled as she read it again. It was no longer necessary for them to remember how she loved. Now, she was remembered for how she helped others love themselves, and that was enough. The main center was preparing for yet another graduation. It was a simple ritual but full of meaning. Each woman received a certificate, a piece of clothing she had sewn herself, and went up on stage to say her full name out loud, as if she were reintroducing herself to the world. Elisa watched, everything with a full heart. That night, something about her seemed different. It wasn't sadness. It was as if the cycle that had begun so many years ago was finally coming to an end. She was wearing a navy blue dress, her hair tied in a low bun, her eyes slightly tired but alive. He smiled when he saw a young woman who had arrived months earlier, fleeing an abusive relationship, receive her diploma with trembling hands and shout, "I am worthy," in front of the audience. That was why Elisa did what she did. She always had. But outside, under the streetlight on the corner, someone was watching from afar. Caleb had been waiting for that night for weeks. He had heard about the graduation from an old classmate of Elisa's who had unknowingly mentioned the date during a conversation at the local market. He didn't dare approach the gate. He kept to the shadows, with a bouquet of simple flowers in his hands and a folded letter in his pocket. He knew that this might be his last chance to say what he had never had the courage to say. And yet he hesitated. When the lights in the hall went out and the guests began to leave, he took a step back, ready to disappear once more. But he was surprised by a little girl who ran between the adults and bumped into him. She laughed, apologized, and returned to her mother's arms. Elisa, who was right behind her, looked in the direction of the commotion and saw it. At first, she froze. Her eyes met his with the same intensity as years ago, but now there was a different weight there. No more pain, no more anger. There was maturity. Caleb didn't come closer. He just held out the bouquet from a distance. She walked toward him, stopped a few feet away, and asked without ceremony, "Why?" He took a deep breath, swallowed all his rehearsed phrases, and answered with the only truth he had left. "Because loving you was admitting that I needed to change. And at that time, I wasn't ready to be another man." The silence between them was not hostile. It was mature, real. She took the bouquet delicately, and for the first time she touched his hands in so many years. There was no tremor, only understanding. He held out the letter. She declined. "I already know what it says." And she smiled. It was a sweet smile, of someone who chose not to seek revenge but also not to forget. You don't have to give me anything anymore. Just promise me you'll never hide from yourself again. Caleb nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. Do you forgive me? He whispered. I have for a long time, she replied, but today you're the one who needs to forgive yourself. She walked back inside with calm steps, and he stood there, motionless, as if the world had stopped just for that scene to happen. After a few minutes, he smiled to himself. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel pain. He felt relief, and right there, he sat on the bench in the square, took off his shoes, put his feet on the ground, and closed his eyes. The man who once had everything and didn't know how to love was now just someone trying to start. And that in itself was the true miracle. The next morning, a news report talked about the success of the sewing project that bore Elisa's name. It showed women smiling, children playing in the background, and a serene woman teaching how to align a thread in a fabric without it breaking. The caption read, "Where there is sewing, there is reconstruction." And among the images in the article, there was a small detail that no one noticed. A man discreetly sweeping the courtyard of the center, wearing a cap and a simple shirt, smiling to himself while holding a white rose that had fallen on the ground. That was the end, or maybe the beginning. If this story touched your heart, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who also needs to remember that life always gives back, one way or another. And don't leave now. The next video is already on the screen, and it promises to be even more moving. If this story touched you, don't leave without leaving a like. It shows that you value stories that touch you deeply. Subscribe to the channel right now to receive our next moving stories. And tell me in the comments, do you believe that life gives everything back in the right time? I really want to read your opinion. And if your heart is still open, the next video is already on the screen. Click and come and be moved by another twist that will stay with you for a long time.